Dr. Wachter, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a great pleasure to be with you. Thanks.
So I guess we'll just kind of jump into it about the benefit of these AI scribes. I know you've written about how EHR has created pajama time. Are ambient AI scribes able to realistically reverse that trend, or are we kind of overstating their ability?
Reverse is a little strong because the genesis of pajama time, I think, originally was documentation of the visit itself, and now has also morphed into answering 100 emails from patients. And so Scribes doesn't address that. Hopefully, other AI will. So it doesn't completely solve the problem of pajama time, but I think it's the first technology we've seen that says to physicians, we can give you back some of not only your time, but of the humanity of the doctor-patient visit. We can create a mechanism by which you can make eye contact with your patients and both appear and also be paying real attention to them as opposed to being a pretty expensive, grumpy data entry clerk. So in that way, it does save some time, but I think it's more important in kind of resurrecting the humanity of the doctor-patient visit.
Yeah, I guess just to follow up on that, I mean, what is making these tools, or what about these tools is really changing patient workflows or physician workflows rather? I mean, is it those that time saved in documentation, or is it more about that connection with patients and the ability to have eye contact?
Yeah, a little bit of both, but I think the main thing it is doing, I mean, if you think about it, what happened was when we were on paper, I'd scribble down whatever I would scribble down in my notes, sometime in real time, but I could kind of make eye contact with the patient while I was doing that, sometime afterwards. And what the electronic health record did was enable a whole bunch of new requirements of what needed to be in the note, because all of a sudden there was a mechanism by which my boss, Medicare, United Healthcare, my malpractice lawyer, the quality measures, all sorts of entities could be looking over my metaphorical shoulder and make me do stuff that they couldn't make me do before. So, and of course, given that opportunity, they took advantage of that. So all of a sudden, the note became bloated, it became full of check boxes, and became sort of disheartening, not only because it drove the physician sort of away from what he or she thought they were supposed to be doing, which is listening to this other human talk about their issues, but also a little bit of, in some ways, both a time sink and a cognitive sink, in that you're spending so much of your energy inputting stuff that you're not really fully there, fully present and listening for the patient. What it did was relieve you to a large extent of that documentation burden, and it was very important that it did some magic. I mean, it was not simply a voice to text translator, which we've had for a dozen years. If that's all it did and it produced a transcript of my conversation with a patient, it would be entirely worthless. The real magic and where generative AI came in was that it could take this conversation and to some extent figure out what should be in and what should be out of the note. In your description of your chest pain or your headache, out how wonderful it was playing with your grandchildren last weekend or how well Johnny did in the soccer game. But also pull things together in a formula that is very important for the documentation of a note. So if I start out saying I've had chest pain, and then I tell you a little bit about my focaccia recipe, and get down to talking about my shortness of breath 5 minutes later, those two things go together in the note. So the AI had to be smart enough to do that. So the tools, really very quickly, 2 or 3 years ago, the tools all of a sudden started being rolled out that were smart enough to do that. And doctors said this solves a really important problem. I can now both make eye contact with my patient, be engaged, and not spend this enormous amount of time documenting. Where I think we probably overhyped it or maybe overestimated what its impact would be was we thought it would save 5 minutes a visit or 10 minutes a visit. It turns out it doesn't save that much time, saves a little bit. But part of the reason is the repurposing of the time, meaning that it probably does save me a decent amount of time typing and documenting. And some of that time is repurposed into actual genuine human contact, which feels better for the doctor and feels better for the patient. And I think, although it's hard to prove, I think is ultimately better for healthcare, in that it's more likely I'm going to be really tuned into what's going on with you and ask the right questions and probe the right issues.
Another thing I know, like you use the language training wheels for AI documentation. Could you kind of explain that idea? Like, why is AI and documentation the right entry point there, and what makes scribes kind of lower risk, I guess, than AI in other areas?
Yeah, I'll tell you a quick story, which is that, I write in my book that AI in healthcare is not new. AI in healthcare was like a really hot issue in the late 70s and early 80s, believe it or not. Uh, Now, it wasn't ready for prime time for a lot of reasons. All of our documentation was on paper. So if you wanted to use a computer to do AI, you had to re-enter all the data into the computer. There was no such thing as a cloud. And so there were a lot of reasons it was not ready for prime time. And also the technology of AI at the time was the kind of early years of AI was all if-then statements. And if-then works fine for, if the patient has a sore throat and swollen lymph nodes, they probably have strep throat or mono. Uh, it falls apart very quickly when patients actually have the problems that real patients have, which is five things going on and three different diagnoses, and they're on nine medicines. And so, in some ways, it wasn't quite ready for prime time. But in some ways, the biggest problem that the early founding fathers, and they were almost all guys, had was they decided as they had to pick across the universe of possible use cases, they decided to focus on diagnosis. And I interviewed a bunch of them for my last book, The Digital Doctor, and asked, like, why did you do this? And they said, well, we weren't naive about how complicated it was or how hard it would be to get it right. We just thought it was the most interesting problem. These are very smart folks who often had MDs and PhDs in computer science. And so it very quickly flamed out. And it flamed out in part because of the flaws I've already mentioned, that, re-entering the data and this if-then structure wasn't very robust. But it also flamed out because you don't start on the hardest problem, because particularly one where if you get it wrong, you can kill somebody. That is not a good strategy to win over hearts and minds of the incumbents, in this case, the doctors, to gain trust, because at some point something will go really wrong and you'll hurt somebody or kill somebody. And so this time, and the analogy, I live in San Francisco, so we tend to think a lot about driverless cars. Like, how did that happen? Because it's a miracle. And it didn't start with a driverless car. It started with cruise control. It started with and then added, okay, can you apply the brakes automatically if I'm going too fast and catching up too quickly to the car in front of me? And can you signal me when my head seems to be bobbing and I might be falling asleep or I'm going into a lane where there's a car? And then eventually you with a lot of testing and trial and error, you get to autonomous vehicles. So you do not start with the hardest problem. You start with easier, more tractable problems. You gain experience and you gain trust. So this time around, as the AI got much better, some of the fundamental problems from the 1980s have been solved. The data are all digital. We have cloud storage, which provides much more access to data. We have new AI that really is no longer a bunch of if-then statements, but can actually deal with the complexity of real medicine and understand unstructured data. But in addition, I would say if we started with diagnosis being the first use case, that would have been a big problem, because as good as it is, and I use AI for diagnosis help all the time, it sometimes gets it wrong. It sometimes hallucinates. And when it does, particularly if I'm either not very good at my job or asleep at the switch, I can say this patient has the wrong diagnosis and label them with that and maybe treat them for the wrong thing and probably hurt them. And if that were to happen, very quickly, you'd lose support of this technology. So people sometimes talk about a two by two quadrant, a two by two matrix, and it's sort of feasibility or ease of getting the thing right. And on the other axis is sort of the consequences of if you get it right or to get it wrong. Diagnosis is both hard to do, hard to get right, and if you get it wrong, you can kill somebody. So I think this time around we're being sort of smarter and more thoughtful, and that is to begin in the quadrant of relatively easy things to do that if you get wrong, probably you're not going to kill anybody. And it turned out that AI scribes were that. And, there was already a model for this in places like UCSF where I work. We had scribes. So 10 years ago, we began hiring mostly pre-medical students to come into the office and type while I might be talking to the patient. So there was a model for a non-expert, the non-physician, to take in this data, understand it, have some general rules, and put it on charts. So we sort of knew how to do that. The tools were very good, but at the end of the day, getting absolutely everything right in a note, it's not inconsequential if there's an error, but it's pretty unlikely you're going to kill somebody if you have an error. So it turned out to be just the right quadrant in that 2 by 2 table, something that the technology was good enough to do, was good enough to do well, and solved a really important problem. Physicians have been complaining about eye contact and data entry stuff and pajama time for the last 10 or 15 years, basically since EHR. And so the combination of being a real live use case that physicians saw as being useful, and patients did as well. As patients noticed that the doctors were looking at them, appeared to be listening. Solved it not perfectly, but well enough. Was not going to be autonomous, meaning that it's going to draft a note, and I now have an opportunity to review it, and at least one hopes catch an error if it exists. And even if there is an error, it's not the end of the world. And then from a health system perspective, because the health systems were probably going to be the ones buying it, the health system might say, if I can have happier doctors, happier patients, and maybe save a few minutes per visit, economically, it's probably going to come close to paying for itself, maybe even better than that. And certainly when you factor in the cost of recruiting a new physician, which for primary care docs is often estimated in the $1 million range, if this makes my doc significantly happier and helps me recruit and retain doctors, there's probably an economic ROI to do it. So all of the ducks lined up for this being the first use case. I think investors saw that and invested in a number of companies. The companies that built the tools were pretty good. And what you had was, I think, a formula for success, and I think it's worked out pretty well. I think for a place like UCSF, all of our 3,000 or 4,000 doctors now have access to an AI scribe. About 70% of them use it. About 90% of them say, I love it. And we've almost gotten to the point where if we turned it off, we might lose a fair number of doctors, or it would be hard to recruit a doctor if we didn't offer them an AI scribe. It's almost become sort of an expectation of practice now.
So I do kind of want to jump ahead to any potential like drawbacks. I know you said if it makes a mistake, obviously it's not, the end of the world if it gets one thing wrong in there. But what are kind of those any complications that physicians are seeing?
Yeah, I mean, it is not perfect. I think the tools are getting better, but ultimately, what you'd like is a tool that's that documents quite differently for a cardiologist versus a primary care doc. And right now, they do a little bit of that, but not perfectly. That I think will get better over time as they get more data and do more reps. Um, if it does make a mistake, again, not the end of the world, but not nothing. You'd like the physician to be reviewing the note. And as I spend a fair amount of time on book, talk about, this human in the loop idea sounds better on paper than it is in reality. Meaning that if, I've used the scribe and the last 49 notes that it created for me, I reviewed in detail and they were perfect. Am I really going to be fully attentive as I review note number 50? If I'm human, the answer is no. At some point, I'll begin over trusting the data. We're not that worried in this one about de-skilling. That'll come up in other things like diagnosis. I mean, it's hard for me to imagine that I'm going to de-skill my ability to read over a note and say whether it's accurate or not. That doesn't feel salient. It comes up a lot for other things. Maybe the biggest downside, I guess one downside is I think it maybe has underdelivered a little bit in terms of the efficiency advantages. I think people were counting, when you looked at the ROI calculations early on, if I was a health system and it was going to cost me $3 million to bring in an AI scribe, I sort of said, well, if it saves 5 minutes a visit, I can, that's 1 or 2 extra patients a day, and the math works out. And I think in the early study so far, there has been some time savings, not quite as much as people would have anticipated. I think probably the biggest potential downside is sort of a question of how you and how I think, which is a little bit of a trade-off. On the one hand, I think I like the idea that I'm now listening really intently to the patient while the patient is speaking, and I'm making eye contact, and the patient can tell I'm engaged and paying attention to them, not my computer. That is a great thing. On the other hand, when I, in the old days, would be typing my note, that was a cognitively active process. And sometime while I was typing my note, I would say, damn, I forgot to ask whether she has a pet at home or whether she's recently, traveled and drank fresh water from a lake or whatever it was. Um, there's something in the process of the human thinking about something and writing it that is probably more cognitively active than the human reading over a draft of something. And I think this comes up it's marbled through education. It's probably marbled through your world as a journalist too. That
Mhm.
if the thing's drafting something for you, is there something lost because you didn't go through the incredible hardship of doing the first draft? And, these are trade-offs. I think, people are voting with the doctors are voting with their feet and saying we're willing to make that trade-off. And we think the advantage of being less cognitively exhausted by listening to the patient and being more engaged probably has net advantages over the advantage of me typing, an entire note. But I'd say that's probably to me the biggest trade-off. And at this point, a little hard to quantify. I haven't seen a really good study that kind of gets at this instinct I have that there's a little bit lost when I'm not typing my own note.
Mhm. No, that makes sense. Then I kind of wanted to go back to, I know you mentioned at San Francisco that I think it was 70% of the docs are now using their AI scribe. Do you have any insight into the 30% that aren't? Is that just kind of they're set in their ways, they don't want to
Eh,
switch or?
Probably a little bit of everything, a little bit of what I'm doing now works fine. It's not like this is, if I don't use it, I can't practice or practice effectively. And I've been
Mm,
doing this thing this way for 20 years. Technology is not very complex, but not nothing. You've got to learn a little bit about how to use it. Um, and get it to get your note, which is recorded on your phone, then to sync up with Epic and all of that. It's not massive amounts of training and change management, but it's not zero. There's some people who find that actually what I was saying before, that the process of me typing and writing the note actually is valuable to my thought process and don't want to completely give that up. But I think for a lot of people, it depends to some extent on what your work is like. Like if you are in primary care, your history taking is prolonged. Um, you're taking in a whole lot of data. It might be more useful than if you're in a highly specialized area where you only have a series of set questions, and they actually are pretty checkboxy. You're asking them, for patients who come in with new shoulder pain, and if you're an orthopedics clinic, you're not asking about the universe of symptoms they have. And it may be that the time value of sort of moving away from checkboxes or documenting yourself isn't that high. I think for some people, they tried it and found that it did make some errors every now and then, and therefore they felt like I can't trust it. For some people, the physical exam is a particularly important part of their process, and it's not great with the physical. It doesn't really, you can't do the physical exam. You have to basically narrate your physical exam, which is a little
mm,
bit weird. You've never had to do that before, so that really is a change in process. I think it's kind of it's a whole bunch of issues. I wouldn't say all 30% are Luddites stuck in their ways and all that. I think, a fair number of them have tried it and just found the advantages are not that great compared to, the status quo. And that's fine. And we're not certainly not mandating that people use it. Some people have found that patients are a little bit off put in when they see, we're supposed to ask for consent for the patient, and some patients are a tiny bit creeped out by it. So I think there's a whole variety of reasons, but the technology didn't exist 3 years ago. There aren't many technologies in healthcare that within 3 years, it's an entirely elective technology. You don't have to use it, and it has a 70% adoption rate. That's pretty good for us.
yeah, definitely. Um, I know we kind of talked about over reliance there and how, obviously you're not going to forget how to proofread. Um,
I
but
hope. Yeah, I mean, not you're not going to forget how to proofread. You may stop proofreading very, very
sure.
thoughtfully as you have come to, I mean, it's a general human tendency that when you come to rely on a technology, you're going to trust the technology and probably be a little bit asleep at the switch.
Yeah. Do you see that as kind of a real risk? And is there ways that maybe health systems can put in place? You have to have either someone set to do that as, double check things or some other kind of solution.
We're thinking about it. I was talking to a senior leader at one of the very big tech companies today, And he said, we are actually beginning to develop tools, for example, for medical education that are different. For example, it may be that the student has access to a scribe, but there's something embedded in the actual process that makes them do more, makes them, there's something that's actually testing to see that you reviewed it carefully. Maybe it's somehow looking at your eye movements, or it's, making sure that you. Now, will we do what TSA does, which is throw an image of a bomb or a gun into the video feed periodically to make sure you're awake? Probably not a terrible idea. You'd have to be 1000% sure that if you build in an intentional mistake that it can't possibly reach the patient. But if you think about fish testing, and you're probably in your email system, you get a fake email periodically to make sure you're awake and you catch it. Um, I do think what we shouldn't do is just say, here's, I think, one of the fundamental challenges in AI meets healthcare. Maybe AI meets everything. The tools they're now good enough, and here's one of them, Scribe, good enough to be useful, not perfect. So I think it's going to be important for us to really be strategic about, okay, so the system we're going to have is this AI human dyad and the human in the loop. And then to just say, all right, I'm done. I've got a perfect system. That's just going to be wrong. And so to really be quite intentional about what does the training look like to be sure people understand that the tools are not perfect. What does the system look like? Maybe the system signals you with its green, at the top of the page when it's sure it got 100% right, and it's yellow when there was a word it didn't quite understand, or there's some internal conflict in the note. And so you see that signal and I got to review this yellow note more carefully. Maybe it is the fake image maybe it throws in an error periodically to make sure you're awake. Hard to know. I don't think anybody's really tested these out yet, but I think the key concept here is the AI human dyad sounds safer than it is.
Hmm.
It certainly is not a fail-safe system, and we've got to be quite intentional about how to make that right. Then we get to the new set of problems, maybe not as relevant for scribing as other things, but the study that came out a year or so ago that looked at diagnostic reasoning and said humans did 65%, humans with AI did like 68%, but the AI by itself was 90%, meaning that the human in the loop actually screwed things up. So we will begin seeing times where the human intervention actually degrades the performance. That recent study in Nature Medicine that looked at patient uses of patient-facing diagnostic tools where the patients kind of muck things up by putting in the wrong prompts and all that. So not only is the human in the loop an imperfect system, there may be times where it actually degrades the performance. That's probably less true. It's sort of hard for me to imagine that in me reviewing my own note that was just created 2 minutes ago, I'm going to look at something and the AI said and correct it when the AI was right and I was wrong. Doesn't seem completely relevant to that use case, but I think it's just emblematic of it's just human in the loop just sounds really good, and when you actually probe like how is this going to work in real life, it's a pretty imperfect system.
Sure. We touched on ROI, and obviously the cost of
I
recruiting a
have
new physician.
we have a new paper on ROA, by the way, that just came out a couple of days ago,
Oh, great.
in JAMA Internal Medicine. Lead author is Lisa Rotenstein, and we sort of spend a fair amount of time just how should you even think about ROI in the context of tools like Scribes.
Great. I mean, is it more, is it a financial kind of ROI, or is it more on that retention and physician morale?
Yeah, I think the answer today is you'd have to say it's more on the retention, physician experience, sort of joy in practice, and maybe to a little bit of extent, patient experience as well. All of which I think do have quantifiable ROI. Again, when you factor in the cost of recruiting and retaining and replacing a physician, and probably the cost of retaining a patient who too. I mean, we certainly have had patients say, "I don't want to come here. It looks like the doctor's not paying attention to me." But I think if you just did the math on X amount of minutes saved translated into more patients coming through. First of all, I think there's a problem there too, which is if I save 5 minutes, do I repurpose that into 5 minutes of the hamster wheel spinning that much faster? If part of my motivation was to have a happier doctor and patient, probably you shouldn't. You might say half of it goes to that, and because I'm trying to defray my investment and I want more patients to be seen, but half of it is kept by the doctor and the patient. Uh, but that becomes a tricky management question. But I'd say today you would say that there's a little, and we had another paper at UCSF came out maybe a month or two ago. I think the lead author is AJ Holmgren, looking at the time saving and ROI specifically. That basically said it comes out to be about neutral. That you do save a little bit of time if you do the math on that amount of time over a course of a year. It sort of pays for the AI scribe. So I think the answer is the AI scribe probably kind of pays for itself just in pure throughput and time savings. But the real benefit is the joy in practice, recruitment, retention, and maybe ultimately winning over hearts and minds and opening the door for more and other AI tools. I think this is going to be super hard to quantify, but at the end of the day, creating an organization that welcomes the next AI tool because they think it will help them do their work and do patient care better as a counterforce to some real, what is this thing and can I trust it? And is it ultimately going to take my job? So, some forces that would have you reject it. I think in some ways, the biggest contribution of AI scribes probably will be winning over hearts and minds and creating receptivity for the next, probably more complex, but maybe even more important AI tools. As I wrote in the book, an AI scribe or an AI chart review tool. These are singles. I mean, the home run here is going to be really robust clinical decision support that helps not only make diagnoses, but helps suggest the right tests, suggest the right treatments. That's where the clinical money is. That's where the money is. That's where the clinical benefit really is. And again, you didn't want to start with that because the stakes are too high. But I think the biggest benefit of scribes when that story is finally written will be winning hearts and minds and creating receptivity for bigger, broader, and ultimately more impactful tools.
Sure. Is there anything we didn't talk about? I know I wanted to get to I wanted to get to a giant leap and kind of the shift to Gen AI. Obviously, we talked about it throughout,
I mean,
but
the overall theme of the book is I came out of it pretty optimistic for its role in healthcare. And in part because I think this is an example of a tool that really does solve a real problem and the users are happy. As one person told me, this is the first tool I've ever seen in IT where people like run to the chief information officer's office and say, I really want this. We haven't had that before. Usually it's I'm running the CIO's office saying, well, why did you bring this in? And it's awful. And couldn't we have found something better? So I think, and the reason I'm optimistic, I think the tools have really remarkable capabilities. I mean, 3 years ago, the idea that you could replace a human scribe with an AI scribe would have been inconceivable. And, I feel sorry for the companies in a way because, they built these unbelievable tools and they're breathtakingly good. And within 2 years, they became commoditized and prices are falling. And now Epic's going to do it themselves. And it's a pretty tough market. But the tools are really kind of remarkable in solving important problems. And then the other point I've made is why I'm optimistic in healthcare is the system is so broken that we need tools like this in order for just to get through our day, for us to do our jobs. And as I've said many times, the day GPT came out, it wasn't like I was on Google saying I need a better search engine. I couldn't even imagine a better search engine, but I certainly don't know anybody who said the healthcare system is perfect and we don't need help. And so it's really in some ways, the theme of the book is that I am quite optimistic. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be perfect. There'll be plenty of speed bumps, but because the tools really do amazing things, solve important problems, and the system is in desperate need of transformation.
great. Dr. Wachter, thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure.